Somewhere to Live is a new research paper published by the Helen Clark Foundation. The Foundation is an independent, non-partisan think tank which aims to contribute to policy debates on how to achieve a more inclusive, sustainable and peaceful society. The contents of this presentation do not reflect the views of the Foundation nor its patron. A 30-year boom in property investment between 1989 and the present has dramatically undermined the social fabric and economic security of Aotearoa New Zealand. This graph shows the real house price index, illustrating the dramatic growth across the long term. The impacts of skyrocketing house prices are severe. In just 3 years between 2015 and 2018, household net worth grew by $400,000 for the wealthiest 20% of households and just $1,000 for the poorest 20%. The impacts on Māori populations are also significant. They are 5 times as likely as Pākehā to be homeless and only half as likely to own their own home. And since 2014, the waiting list for public housing has increased more than threefold. These outcomes all point to the social crisis that results when house prices and rents become unaffordable for much of the population. There is strong consensus that we do have a crisis, and the topic has been debated heavily in politics and the media in recent years. However, there is not a clear consensus on the causes of this crisis, and it has been attributed to a range of drivers, including foreign investment, immigration, taxation, a cultural bias towards property investment, inadequate housing supply, and restrictive land use planning. The position I take in this paper is that the crisis results from a combination of factors, and there is no single silver bullet policy that can solve it. The common argument that we just need to build more houses overlooks key dynamics of the housing system. This paper agrees that housing supply is important, but increasing supply alone is not going to be sufficient to address the crisis. The problem is not just how many homes are being built, it's the way we are using them as financial investments. 2 things need to happen to transform the current system, which treats houses as investments, into one which prioritises access to housing and affordability. First, curbing speculation so that it is harder and less attractive to speculate on housing. Second, boosting the supply of genuinely affordable housing and ensuring that it is managed to maintain its affordability over the long term. In this presentation, I'll first explain what it means to treat housing as a financial investment and how this leads to unaffordable prices. I'll then discuss policies that can be used to transform the housing system into one that meets the needs of society rather than acting as a vehicle for investment. As mentioned on the previous slide, housing in New Zealand is often treated as a financial asset. Here I'll make a comparison to show how this changes the way that we think about housing and our decisions to buy and sell residential property. On the left-hand side, if homes were not an investment but simply for living in, we would only buy what we needed to provide shelter for ourselves and our families. In most cases, we wouldn't pay the full cost up front, but instead rely on mortgage finance to spread that cost and pay it back over time. The value of the property is defined by the use that we get from it over the period we live there, based on its size, locations, and amenity. On the right-hand side, we see that things are quite different when homes are financial assets. Instead of buying what we need for ourselves, we will buy as many properties as we desire for our investment portfolio, often renting out those that we don't live in ourselves. We can use existing property as collateral to extend mortgage finance, borrowing substantial amounts to pay for these additional investments. And the value of the property is disconnected from the value that we ourselves would get from using it. Instead, we are concerned about the future rental revenue and potential capital gains. So how does this push prices up to levels that are unaffordable for most of us? Before I explain this in the next slide, I need to point out key features of the housing system that shape our behaviour and the possibilities to access housing. First, we have relatively limited regulation of mortgage lending. While the Reserve Bank have implemented loan-to-value ratios in recent years, there are other ways to limit lending in relation to our incomes which are not currently being used. The relatively low level of regulation is reflected in the level of household debt to GDP, which for New Zealand sits at around 95%. This is the 7th highest in the world. Second, capital gains on property are not taxed. This has been debated at length, and implementing a tax was recommended by the Tax Working Group in 2019. Third, there are limited alternatives to home ownership if you are looking for secure, long-term housing. While improvements to rental regulations have been implemented in recent years, it is still relatively insecure to rent, and many rental properties are either of low quality or poorly maintained. In addition to this, the government pension is not enough to cover the cost of renting, and so there is additional pressure to own your own home before you retire. In the context of these three features, low regulation of mortgage lending, untaxed capital gains, and limited alternatives to home ownership, the dynamics of the housing market can be described as the cyclical growth of house prices and mortgage debt. This is cyclical because there is a two-way relationship between house prices and mortgage lending. The higher the prices, the more we have to borrow, and as we borrow more, the more the prices can be maintained at these very unaffordable levels. This cyclical growth takes place in an environment where there's an expectation of continued house price growth. This is where people have seen the prices have grown a lot in recent months or years, and they assume that this will continue into the future. This is often perpetuated by local media that repeatedly report on booming property markets in their headlines, including forward projections for continued house price growth that often come from economists that work for the very same banks that are providing our mortgage finance. To explain this, we'll start with the buyers, and here I make an important distinction between two groups. There are the speculative investors who do not need a house for themselves but are looking to profit from rapid price growth by buying up properties that they will either rent out or flip within a short time frame. Second, we have people who are looking for a house for themselves, but due to the lack of alternatives in the way of renting, they will often buy a house to live in at a much higher price than its actual value as a place to live, simply to get into home ownership. In both cases, they have incentives and constraints that mean that they will buy houses at much higher prices relative to their incomes. As a result, there is higher demand for mortgage debt to pay these higher prices. With limited regulation of mortgage lending, the amount of finance provided by banks can increase quite rapidly. As a result of this, the banks lend out more, increase their profits, and also their capital base. The capital base for any bank is the amount of capital that they must hold relative to the total amount that they've lent out. As this capital base grows, there's an increased supply of mortgage credit, allowing banks to lend out more money to finance buyers. As a result of this, there's then a growing population of homeowners with significant levels of debt relative to their incomes, and so they are now much less willing to sell these houses at a lower price, which in turn feeds back into higher property prices. It also shows that as we borrow more to pay ever higher prices, the system actually relies on the next buyer always being able to take on more debt. This is where the way that we finance housing really matters, because as long as the supply of mortgage credit outpaces the supply of housing, prices will continue to rise. Policy interventions need to recognise this cycle and intentionally disrupt it, otherwise the prices will keep growing until the bubble bursts. Increasing the supply of housing is important, but it needs to be accompanied with measures that keep mortgage lending under control. We can take a look at the data for New Zealand to see how this cycle has played out. First, we have the total amount of household debt over the past 20 years, separated by different types of debt. So we have consumer loans, student loans, and loans for housing. The total amount has increased continuously, and we see that the largest share of this and the share of the growth comes from the loans for housing. In fact, we see that the growth of housing loans follows a similar pattern to the growth of house prices, shown by the black line. I argue that the house price growth that we've seen has only been possible with this continuous growth in mortgage lending. Second, we can take a look at the data on mortgage lending. This graph represents the total amount of residential mortgage lending just for a 2-year period between June 2017 and 2019. So this provides a snapshot to show the nature of mortgage lending over this period where prices were growing very quickly. On the y-axis, we have the total volume of lending, and on the x-axis, the level of indebtedness for the borrowers. At the far right, you have the lending to the most heavily indebted borrowers who have borrowed more than 6 times their income, so there's a debt-to-income ratio of greater than 6. At the left-hand side, we have the least indebted borrowers who have only borrowed up to 3 times their income. There are 2 important features of this graph. First, we see that a large number of borrowers are carrying very high levels of debt relative to their income. Second, we see that first home buyers, this is accounted for in grey, only account for a small fraction of the total lending. Most of it is lent out to buyers who are either purchasing additional properties or they're working their way up the property ladder. This data suggests that a large share of the demand to buy houses comes from investors, not first home buyers. Another important feature of the housing affordability crisis is the way that price growth has spread beyond our major cities and across the country. Here I have mapped out the annual price growth between 2015 and 2019 across different regions. The darker areas have higher price growth, the lighter areas have lower. What we see across this 5-year period is that the boom started in Auckland and Queenstown and then proceeded to spread all over the country. After very heavy price growth in 2015 to 16, the Auckland market plateaued while prices picked up significantly in smaller cities and towns. Some attribute this to the introduction of a differential LVR regulation for Auckland. However, it also demonstrates how price growth in one major centre can create this huge differential in prices between the expensive centre and the less expensive towns and cities around it. As a result, many people will leave for these relatively cheaper areas, pushing the prices up there. However, as we saw in the previous graph on mortgage lending, I argue that it is not just those who want to buy their own home who are doing this, but also investors who see the potential for substantial profits in areas that have got cheaper prices to start with. So, what are the broader impacts of treating housing as a financial asset when it drives prices beyond affordable levels? First, it dramatically worsens inequality. There is significant evidence that Māori are not given equal treatment in our housing system. In many respects, this did not start with the current affordability crisis, but stretches back to colonisation under the British Empire. After this, there were successive instances of eviction and discriminatory housing policies. At the present time, the outcomes for Māori fail to uphold the Article 3 treaty obligations to ensure equality of outcomes and opportunities between Māori and non-Māori. There are also major intergenerational inequalities. Anyone born after around 1990 is likely to be priced out of home ownership, as the prices have grown far faster than incomes. This will only increase with time, creating a nation that is sharply divided between homeowners and a growing population of renters. Lastly, the activities of investors buying and selling, and particularly those that engage in flipping properties to reap the capital gain without even renting it out, displace people from the current housing stock and reduce the supply. It also has impacts on land use, because most of the price increase is in the land value, and in many cases land banking is much more profitable than actually developing housing. This slows down development and again reduces the supply of housing. It also limits the diversity of development, because some types of housing, usually the single-family house, are much more attractive as a financial investment, even if these homes don't meet the diverse needs of the different household types we have across society. Lastly, it has profound impacts on the level of household debt, because people are not just borrowing money to buy their own house, but also to finance a number of properties. This creates some constraints at the household level, as a significant share of our income is used to service our mortgages. In the worst cases, households will spend less on food, healthcare, and education in order to meet their mortgage repayments. The level of mortgage debt also creates a broader risk to our economy, because with so many households spending a large share of their income repaying debt, there is less money to spend in the local economy, and this in itself has the potential to trigger a recession. Overall, we see that the current housing affordability crisis is damaging far beyond the housing system, affecting inequality in land use and creating new economic risks. Now that we've looked at how house prices have reached such unaffordable levels and the wider impacts of this, I'll switch focus to explore how it could be different. The approach proposed in this paper is based around the claim that decent housing is a human right, not a privilege. This is because the impacts we are currently seeing in terms of homelessness and deprivation show that the affordability crisis is undermining people's ability to live and contribute to society in a fundamental way. If decent housing is a human right, then what should our housing policies try to achieve? First, housing should be permanently affordable across different income levels. That 30-year boom that I showed on the first slide cannot continue. Second, the way that we finance housing should support access and home ownership rather than enabling speculation. Third, housing needs to meet our needs. It must be warm, dry, energy efficient, and well located close to jobs, education, and public services. There's a tendency during a housing crisis to lower our standards and think that it's good enough just to get houses up wherever we can. But it isn't. Lastly, we need to intentionally provide diverse types of tenure in housing management to ensure that housing meets local needs. This includes housing for different types of households, such as singles, families, and elderly people, and also different forms of tenure, such as papakainga, which is housing developed on communally owned Māori land. With these goals in mind, what could be done to address the crisis and transform the housing system? In this paper, I propose a number of measures, however they can be grouped into two key strategies. First is to curb speculation by dismantling the system of finance and taxation that make it so attractive and lucrative to invest in property. Second, a substantial increase in the supply of genuinely affordable housing, with long-term management to ensure that the houses stay affordable over the long term. First, we'll focus on curbing speculation. Remember, the earlier slides discussed how we treat housing differently when it's a financial asset, and this plays into the feedback cycle between house prices and mortgage lending. To curb speculation, policies should intentionally dismantle that cycle. 3 measures are proposed to do this. First, introducing a comprehensive capital gains tax on housing, following the recommendations of the tax working group. The purpose of this measure is simply to ensure fair tax treatment of housing. It's often argued that CGT isn't a panacea, and I agree, it's just one of a set of measures required to rebalance the system. Second, introducing limits on mortgage lending in relation to our incomes would make it harder to use mortgage financing to speculate on housing. This would be targeted to high-income households to avoid unfairly penalising low-income groups. It's also important that the introduction of these limits is phased over time, giving clear signals to buyers that they will be tapered down over the medium term. These first 2 measures, eliminating the tax incentives and restricting mortgage lending, will bring prices down. So we have a third policy that provides a buffer for households that currently have a large mortgage. This is a refinancing scheme. It allows households to clear their mortgages faster and reduce the overall cost burden. The government can offer to refinance a portion of household mortgages at 0 interest so that they can clear them more quickly and avoid ending up in negative equity. This intervention will also create benefits by reducing the overall amount of household debt in the economy. The second strategy is to boost the supply and long-term management of affordable housing. There are 2 policies to do this. The first focuses on supporting papakainga, which is a relatively small but very important component of our housing system. Papakainga is housing developed on communally owned Māori land, which is not developed for profit but to support the well-being of communities, often with multi-generational housing. If you haven't already read Jade Kake's book, Rebuilding the Kainga, I strongly recommend it. It gives a very good overview of the current housing policies and the challenges to scale up Papakainga development. Drawing from this book, there are 3 areas where government support can be expanded. Removing the barriers to access finance for developing Papakainga housing, improving the affordability of development through reforms to consenting rates and development contributions, and also addressing challenges with governance and legal access to Māori land, as many blocks have been subdivided and then combined through amalgamation schemes. The second policy alongside this is state-led delivery of affordable housing. This calls for a major rethink in the way we deliver housing. Rather than relying on market-led development, which is prone to boom and bust cycles and doesn't always deliver the right housing in the right place, the state can plan and deliver housing in a similar way to infrastructure. There is already legislation in development for Kainga Ora to act as an urban development authority. Local growth planning processes can estimate the needs for affordable housing using projections of population growth and the likely distribution of incomes. Incorporating housing into growth planning allows the land for housing to be allocated to ensure that it's close to public transport and existing amenities. This improves the efficiency of land use and limits sprawl. The responsibility of the Urban Development Authority is to deliver high-quality housing to meet this projected growth. Where private developers cannot provide housing at affordable price points, the Urban Development Authority can deliver this to ensure that the overall housing stock is affordable and meets diverse household needs. Building capacity within the Urban Development Authority to develop and deliver housing is critical to reduce the reliance on private contractors and ensure that the government have the institutional knowledge and capacity to meet future housing needs. These homes, once they're built, can be transferred to the ownership of either hapu or community land trusts to be managed as long-term leasehold properties. This management structure effectively removes the land from the market, preventing speculation and ensuring that it is used in a socially optimal way to meet housing needs. Leasehold properties can be supplied at genuinely affordable prices while still offering a secure tenure option. To recap, these policies are focused on 2 goals. On the left, curbing speculation by reforming taxation, limiting mortgage lending, and providing an option for refinancing. On the right, boosting the supply of permanently affordable homes by expanding Papakainga, as well as the state-led delivery of housing that's transferred to hapu or community land trusts for long-term management as leasehold properties. These policies have a long-term goal to bring down prices to affordable levels and keep them there, avoiding a repeat of the massive intergenerational inequality that we currently have. Homes are not for profit, and the development of Papakainga on communal Māori land is supported. The system of mortgage financing is reformed to support affordability, not to enable speculation. And the ownership and management of housing is placed under hapu or community organisations that can best manage it to meet local needs and protect the land from speculative investment. If these policies were to be implemented, what would need to happen next? First, to curb speculation, sending very clear signals to investors and prospective buyers on the implementation of a capital gains tax, as well as the phased introduction of debt-to-income limits, is important to inform investment decisions and guide prices downward over the medium to long term. To boost supply, building capacity across hapu, community providers and the state are critical to ensure that they have the skills, expertise and government support to deliver and manage housing to best support community needs. These proposed policies work in conjunction with each other across different timescales to fundamentally transform the way we deliver and manage housing. While state-led delivery of affordable homes can provide shorter-term relief from the crisis, the longer-term transformation to dismantle the system that enables houses to be treated as financial investments will be critical to the social and economic well-being of the country.